A millionaire protector returned from overseas only to be paralyzed by the sight of two small twin boys, the sons of his dearest late friend, huddled in a dilapidated doghouse in their own backyard. Their cruel stepfather, a man who had wept so convincingly at their mother's funeral just weeks before, was inside the pristine house, hosting a garden party. Why would two grieving children be cast out like animals while their supposed guardian celebrated? And who would ultimately unlock the cage of secrets that surrounded them? Elias Vance felt the wrongness the moment his car purred to a stop before the immaculate Victorian house. The lawn was a perfect, manicured green, the rose bushes pruned with surgical precision. It was the house he'd known for years, the home of his closest friend, Sarah. But it was corrupted, covered in a glossy veneer that felt brittle and cold. He had been in Singapore when he got the call about the accident, a blur of frantic arrangements and a hollow ache that had yet to subside. He had missed the funeral, a fact that chewed at him with relentless guilt. Now, returning to fulfill a promise he'd made to Sarah long ago, to always look out for her boys, Leo and Sam, he was met with this sterile perfection. It was too quiet, too clean. Grief was messy, chaotic. This was something else entirely. This was an erasure. Through the large bay window, he could see the shapes of people mingling, glasses of wine in their hands, the low hum of polite laughter reaching him even through the closed car door. Richard Thorne, Sarah's husband of less than 2 years, was playing the part of the grieving widower with practiced grace. Elias's hand tightened on the steering wheel. He'd never trusted the man's easy charm, the way his eyes never seemed to smile with his mouth. Sarah had been so happy, though, and for her sake, he had remained silent. Now silence felt like a betrayal. He got out of the car, the late afternoon sun casting long, ominous shadows across the perfect lawn. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming roses, a cloying sweetness that did nothing to mask the bitter taste of foreboding in his mouth. He walked up the stone path, not to the front door, where the party guests were, but around the side of the house, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. A primal pull toward the backyard, toward the giant oak tree where he'd once pushed 2 giggling toddlers on a tire swing. Something was fundamentally broken here, and his entire being, honed by years of navigating corporate hostile takeovers and international crises, screamed that the danger was not in the past, but present. The backyard was as pristine as the front. A slate patio held a handful of Richard's guests, their laughter sharp and jarring. But Elias's eyes were drawn past them, to the far corner of the yard, partially obscured by a neatly trimmed hedge. There sat an old, neglected doghouse, a relic from a pet Sarah had owned years ago. Its paint was peeling, the wood warped and gray. It didn't belong in this perfect garden. It was an oversight, a stain. He stopped, his heart clenched. Something wasn't right. He moved closer, his steps silent on the soft grass, his focus narrowing until the party guests became a distant, meaningless blur. As he rounded the hedge, the sight that met him stole the air from his lungs. Inside the dark, cramped opening of the doghouse, 2 small figures were curled together for warmth, their small bodies trembling slightly in the cooling air. It was Leo and Sam. Their faces were smudged with dirt, their clothes thin and worn. They weren't playing. Their eyes, wide and haunted, were fixed on the distant house, on the sounds of the party they were excluded from. They looked like tiny, forgotten soldiers, abandoned on a battlefield. Sam, the more outgoing of the two, had his arm wrapped tightly around his brother, Leo, who stared into nothingness, his expression utterly vacant. They were 7 years old. Their mother had been buried less than a month ago. Elias felt a cold, protective rage rise within him, a silent, volcanic pressure building behind his ribs. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a ghost from a past he thought he had buried. He looked from the small, shivering boys to the gleaming house, where their stepfather was accepting condolences and pouring champagne. The stark contrast was a physical blow. In that moment, standing in the shadows of the manicured hedge, Elias Vance made a quiet, unbreakable vow. He would not just protect these boys. He would dismantle the life of the man who had put them here. He would burn Richard Thorne's world to the ground and salt the earth, and he would do it with the same cold precision that Richard had used to prune his roses. He took a step forward, and the boys flinched, pressing themselves further into the rotting wood. He knelt down, making himself small, unthreatening. "Leo? Sam?" he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "It's Elias. Your mom's friend." The boys just stared, their silence more damning than any scream. With a gentleness that belied the fury coursing through his veins, Elias coaxed the boys out of the doghouse. He wrapped his own expensive jacket around their thin shoulders, his touch steady and reassuring. He led them by the hand across the lawn, his path a direct, unwavering line toward the patio. The laughter of the guests faltered and died as he approached, a dark, imposing figure with two small, disheveled children in his wake. The air grew thick with confusion. Richard Thorne turned, a welcoming smile plastered on his face, which froze when he saw Elias and the state of the boys. "Elias, I didn't know you were coming," he said, his voice a smooth bomb of feigned surprise. He rushed forward, his expression shifting to one of deep concern. "Boys, what are you doing? You were supposed to be in your room." "I am so sorry, everyone," he announced to his guests, his tone dripping with paternal exasperation. "They've been difficult since their mother passed. Acting out has been a challenge for all of us." Elias ignored the audience. He looked directly at Richard, his gaze as hard and cold as granite. "They were in the doghouse, Richard." The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a physical strike. A few guests gasped. Richard's composure flickered for a fraction of a second before his mask of contrived sorrow slid back into place. He let out a weary sigh, shaking his head as if burdened by a great weight. "I know how it looks," he said, pitching his voice to carry to the onlookers. "They were having a tantrum, throwing things, screaming. I asked them to take a time out in the garden to cool off. They must have hidden in there to be defiant. Grief does strange things to children, you understand." It was a plausible, gaslighting lie, delivered with the practiced ease of a seasoned manipulator. He painted himself as the struggling, patient stepfather, and Elias as the interfering outsider who didn't understand the delicate situation. But Elias saw the flicker of fear in Richard's eyes. He saw the way Leo and Sam shrank behind his legs, their small hands clutching his trousers. The lie was a shield, and Elias knew his first task was to shatter it. Elias bypassed the local authorities for the moment, knowing Richard's carefully cultivated local influence would bog things down. Instead, he invoked a document he and Sarah had drawn up years ago, a failsafe born from a shared, morbid sense of humor after a particularly scary flight. It was a notarized letter, granting him temporary guardianship in the event of an emergency where the primary guardian was deemed unsuitable. It was legally thin, but it was enough to buy him time. He bundled the silent boys into his car and drove away from the pristine house, leaving Richard standing on the lawn, his mask of concern finally slipping into one of pure fury. Elias took them to his own home, a quiet, minimalist sanctuary high in the hills overlooking the city. It was a house built for solitude, not for children, but it was safe. He spent the first day just letting them be. He filled the kitchen with their favorite foods, which Sarah had often mentioned in her emails. He set up a spare room with new beds, soft blankets, and stacks of books and art supplies. For hours they did not speak. Leo, especially, seemed to be lost in a world of his own, his eyes vacant. Sam watched Elias with a wary, animal caution. That evening, as Elias was quietly reading in the living room, Sam approached him, holding out a piece of paper. He had drawn a picture. It was a simple, childish drawing of two stick figures inside a black box. Outside the box stood a much larger stick figure with a jagged, angry mouth. Sam pointed to the big figure. "The quiet game," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "Richard's game. If you make noise, you go in the quiet place." It was the first crack in the wall of silence, a horrifying glimpse into their reality. The next day, Elias left the boys with a trusted housekeeper and drove back to Richard's neighborhood. He didn't go to the house. He went next door, to the home of a woman he remembered from previous visits, an elderly widow named Mrs. Gable who spent most of her days tending her garden. She was hesitant at first, her eyes darting nervously toward Richard's house. She was afraid of him. Elias didn't press. He simply sat with her on her porch swing, speaking softly about Sarah, about his promise to her. After a long silence, her resolve crumbled. "He yells," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Horrible things. When he thinks no one can hear. I see the boys, left out in the yard for hours. In the rain sometimes. I called once, anonymously, to social services. But he must have charmed them. Nothing happened. He's a respected man in this town." Her words were the first external validation, the first stone to build his case upon. The information from Mrs. Gable was crucial, but it was hearsay. Elias needed something concrete, something undeniable. He instructed his lawyer, Cassandra Hayes, to file an emergency motion for access to the house to retrieve the boys' personal effects. It was a standard procedure, and one Richard, wanting to maintain his facade of the cooperative stepfather, could not easily refuse. He agreed, stipulating that he be present. The air in the house was thick with tension. Richard shadowed Elias's every move, his presence a cloying, menacing cloud. He tidied the boys' room, making it look like a page from a catalog, a sterile, unlived-in space. It was another layer of his elaborate deception. But Elias knew children. He knew their secret hiding places, the small nooks where they stashed their treasures. While Richard was momentarily distracted by a phone call, Elias ran his hand along the baseboards, feeling for loose panels, for anything out of place. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of a vent cover near Leo's bed. It was slightly ajar. He pried it open. Inside, tucked deep within the dusty shaft, was a small, spiral-bound sketchbook. Its cover was worn, the corners soft with use. This was it. The instinct that had guided him to the doghouse screamed again. He slipped the book into his jacket pocket just as Richard returned to the room, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Find everything you need?" Richard asked, his voice laced with false cordiality. "Everything," Elias replied, his own voice betraying nothing. Back in his car, he opened the sketchbook. The first few pages were filled with typical childhood drawings. A lopsided sun, a wobbly-looking dog, a portrait of their mother with a bright, wide smile. But as he turned the pages, the images grew darker. The colors became muted, replaced by heavy black and gray crayon. There were drawings of two small boys with tears streaming from their eyes. A drawing of the doghouse, labeled "The Bad Place." Then, the most damning image of all. A large, angry stick figure, clearly labeled "Rich," locking the two small boys inside a closet, its door covered in locks. Below it, a scrawled sentence in a child's unsteady hand read, "Mommy went away. Now we have to be quiet." It was a child's raw, unfiltered testimony of terror. It was the smoking gun. Later that day, the second piece of the puzzle arrived. The private investigator Elias had hired to perform a deep financial audit on Richard delivered his report. The findings were staggering. Richard Thorne, the grieving widower and community philanthropist, had been systematically embezzling from the trust fund Sarah had established for her sons. He had forged documents, created shell corporations, and funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into his own failing business ventures. He wasn't just cruel. He was a common thief, preying on his own stepchildren. The abuse wasn't just about control or discipline. It was about silencing the two people who were the primary beneficiaries of a fortune he wanted for himself. The full scope of his monstrosity was now laid bare. Elias drove straight to the downtown office of Cassandra Hayes. Her firm occupied the top floor of a glass and steel skyscraper, a place of quiet, lethal efficiency that perfectly mirrored Cassandra herself. She was a woman who dealt in facts and leverage, her compassion carefully shielded behind a formidable intellect. Elias laid the sketchbook and the thick financial dossier on her expansive mahogany desk. He said nothing, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Cassandra put on her reading glasses and began with the drawings. She examined each page with a forensic intensity, her expression hardening with every dark image. The faint lines of sympathy around her mouth tightened into a grim, determined line. She then turned to the financial reports, her eyes scanning the columns of figures, the web of transactions and shell companies. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the office was the soft rustle of paper. Finally, she looked up, her gaze sharp and clear. "This is not a custody battle, Elias," she said, her voice low and steady. "This is a criminal case. Multiple felonies. Embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and the drawings, while not legally binding on their own, provide the motive and context for felony child endangerment. He wasn't just neglecting them. He was terrorizing them into silence while he stole their inheritance." She leaned back in her chair, her mind already several moves ahead. "We can go to the police, and we will. But a man like Richard Thorne has connections. He'll lawyer up, post bail, and spend months spinning the story, painting himself as the victim of a malicious takeover by a wealthy stranger. He'll drag the boys through endless depositions and evaluations. We can't let that happen." Elias nodded, his own thoughts running along the same track. "What do you suggest?" "We detonate it," she said simply. "We don't give him time to build a defense. We expose him so completely, so publicly, that the authorities, the media, and his entire social circle are forced to turn on him at once. We create a situation where sending him to prison is the only possible outcome." She gestured to an invitation sitting on her desk. It was for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala, the city's premier charity event. On the letterhead, listed as the event's chairman and keynote speaker, was Richard Thorne. "He's built his entire life on a lie," Cassandra said, a cold fire in her eyes. "It's only fitting that we burn it down in the place where he feels most powerful." The plan was set. They would not just seek justice. They would perform an execution of a man's reputation, live and on stage. Richard was not idle. When the formal petition for emergency guardianship from Elias's lawyer landed on his desk, he launched a swift and vicious counterattack. He leveraged every ounce of the public goodwill he had so carefully manufactured. He went to the police and filed a report, claiming that a wealthy and unstable business rival of his late wife's family, Elias Vance, had become obsessed after her death and had abducted his grieving stepsons. He painted a masterful picture of a man unhinged by sorrow, a predator hiding behind a veil of concern. He then called social services himself, reporting his own stepsons as missing and tearfully recounting how Elias had appeared and taken them by force. He gave an interview to a local journalist, a friend who owed him a favor, spinning a tragic tale of a stepfather trying to hold his broken family together against a powerful, shadowy interloper. The story ran on the front page of the local news website. Grieving philanthropist's children taken by mysterious millionaire. Richard's move was brilliant in its audacity. He seized control of the narrative, framing the conflict not as a case of abuse, but as a custody dispute between a loving stepfather and a dangerous outsider. He made Elias the villain. The move put Elias and Cassandra on the defensive, forcing them to contend with a wave of negative press and official inquiries just days before the gala. It was a calculated risk on Richard's part, designed to intimidate them into a quiet legal settlement. He had underestimated the depth of Elias's resolve. The attack did not deter them. It merely solidified their conviction that a public immolation was the only path forward. The grand ballroom of the Regent Hotel was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over the city's elite, who had gathered for the Children's Hope Foundation Gala. At the center of it all, on a raised dais, stood Richard Thorne, the very picture of dignified grief and selfless charity. He was in his element, bathed in the adoring glow of the spotlight, his voice resonating with carefully crafted emotion as he spoke of his late wife's passion for helping children. "Sarah believed that every child deserves a sanctuary," he said, a single, perfect tear tracing a path down his cheek. "A place of safety, of warmth, of unconditional love. In her memory, and for the sake of our own beloved boys, Leo and Sam, I have dedicated my life to upholding that belief." A wave of sympathetic applause filled the room. It was at that precise moment that Elias Vance entered from the back of the ballroom. He wore a simple, dark suit, an island of somber purpose in the ocean of glittering frivolity. He didn't rush. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace down the central aisle, all eyes turning to follow him. The applause faltered, replaced by confused murmurs. Richard's speech trailed off, his face tightening as he recognized the approaching figure. He attempted to regain control, offering the audience a condescending smile. "Ah, it seems we have a late arrival. Mr. Vance, I believe. Perhaps you could find your seat. The adults are talking." The dismissal was meant to humiliate, to cast Elias as a disruptive fool. Failed. Elias didn't stop until he reached the foot of the stage. He looked up at Richard, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute clarity in the sudden silence. "You're right, Richard. We should talk about what you've been doing." For the children, before Richard could respond, Cassandra Hayes, positioned near the audiovisual booth, gave a quiet signal. The massive screen behind Richard, which had been displaying the foundation's logo, flickered and changed. It now showed a series of bank statements, highlighted lines tracing the flow of money from the Boys Trust Fund into a series of shell corporations owned by Richard Thorne. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "That's a lie. It's fabricated," Richard stammered, his face draining of color. Elias paid him no mind, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "He stole nearly $500,000 from his grieving 7-year-old sons." He then reached into his jacket and pulled out the small sketchbook. And while he was stealing their future, this is what their present looked like one by one. Projected in high resolution, the boys' drawings filled the screen. The angry stick figure, the boys in the closet, the doghouse labeled the bad place. The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. The final piece of the plan was the most devastating. Cassandra moved to the side of the stage, where she had been standing with Sam, who had insisted on being brave. She knelt beside him and gently asked, her voice amplified by a lapel microphone, "Sam, can you tell everyone what Richard calls the quiet game?" Sam, clutching a small stuffed animal Elias had given him, looked out not at the crowd, but directly at the man on the stage. In a voice that was small but perfectly clear, he said, "It's when he locks us in the dark, so no one can hear you cry." The simple, honest testimony of a child shattered Richard's world. His facade didn't just crack. It exploded. "They deserved it!" he shrieked, his face contorted into a mask of pure rage. "Always looking at me with her eyes. Her pathetic, sad eyes. They were a constant reminder that I was never enough for her, that I could never replace their perfect father." His confession, a torrent of pathetic jealousy and malice, echoed through the ballroom. At the back, 2 uniformed police officers, who had entered discreetly moments before, began to walk purposefully down the aisle. The downfall of Richard Thorne was as swift and total as Cassandra had predicted. The public exposure at the gala was a conflagration from which his reputation could never recover. Stripped of his allies and his carefully constructed image, he was left with nothing but the ugly truth of his actions. The news media, which he had so skillfully manipulated just days before, turned on him with a savage ferocity. His story was no longer that of a grieving philanthropist but of a monstrous predator who abused children and stole from them. The trial was a formality. Faced with the irrefutable financial evidence and the powerful, silent testimony of the children's drawings, his legal team could mount no credible defense. Mrs. Gable, emboldened by Richard's public disgrace, came forward and testified about the screaming and the long hours the boys were left in the yard. Other neighbors, previously cowed into silence, corroborated her story. Richard Thorne was found guilty on all counts. Multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and felony child endangerment. The judge, in his sentencing, spoke of the man's profound and calculated cruelty, a betrayal of the most sacred trust. He was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security prison, a sterile box from which his charm could buy him nothing. Elias was granted full and permanent guardianship of Leo and Sam. The pristine Victorian house was sold, its contents liquidated to replenish the boys' ravaged trust fund. Every trace of Richard Thorne was systematically erased from their lives, just as he had tried to erase their spirit. The legal battle was over, but for Elias, the real work was just beginning. Justice had been served, but healing was a longer, quieter process. He had won the war, now he had to help two small boys win their peace. The courtrooms and confrontations faded into the past, replaced by the daunting, hopeful challenge of building a new family from the ashes of the old. 6 months later, the world was a different color. The sterile grays of courtrooms and the false gold of the gala had been replaced by the deep blues and soft whites of the sea. Elias had bought a small, unassuming cottage on a quiet stretch of coastline, far from the city and its ghosts. The house was filled not with expensive art, but with the clutter of childhood. Building blocks, half-finished puzzles, and drawings taped to the refrigerator. These new drawings were different. They were full of color, bright yellows, vibrant greens, and brilliant blues. The sun in these pictures was always smiling. It was a place of healing, the rhythmic sound of the waves a constant, soothing presence. Elias, a man who had commanded boardrooms and navigated global markets, now measured his success in different terms. In small smiles, in peaceful nights, and in the gradual return of trust in two pairs of young eyes. One afternoon, as they were walking along the beach, Leo, who had still not spoken a complete sentence since Elias found him, stopped and pointed a small finger toward the horizon. A sailboat was gliding across the water, its white sail brilliant against the blue sky. "Boat," Leo said, the word clear and distinct. Elias stopped, his heart seizing in his chest. He knelt beside the boy, his own eyes suddenly blurred. "Yes, Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a boat." It was a single word, but it was a key turning in a long rusted lock. It was the beginning of a voice returning. Later that day, Sam sat at the small wooden table on the porch, drawing with a focused intensity. When he was finished, he brought the picture to Elias. It was a drawing of 3 stick figures, a large one in the middle and 2 smaller ones on either side. They were all holding hands. Above them, a huge, smiling sun filled the page. This, Elias knew, was the only victory that had ever truly mattered. The hollow ache of his past, the promise he had made to Sarah, had finally been transformed into a quiet, profound sense of purpose. He was no longer just a protector, he was a father. The world is full of pristine houses with dark secrets locked away in forgotten rooms. It is full of monsters who wear the masks of saviors, who weep the most convincing tears at funerals, and deliver the most moving speeches at galas. They build their kingdoms on the silence of the vulnerable, banking on the belief that no one will look closely enough to see the rot beneath the polished floors. But they forget that there are still people who look. They forget that a promise made to a friend can be a bond stronger than steel, and that true strength is not the power to dominate, but the will to protect. Why must it so often fall to a single, determined individual to unravel the lies that institutions fail to see? And what can we do to ensure that the whispers of the frightened are heard before they are silenced completely? The story of Leo and Sam is a testament to the fact that even after the deepest darkness, a new sun can rise, and that a child's drawing can hold more truth than 1,000 well-crafted lies. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you've been moved by the journey of Elias, Leo, and Sam, please let us know in the comments below. We believe in the power of stories to shine a light on both the darkness and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Sharing your thoughts helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light. We wish you and your loved ones safety, strength, and peace.